Hello, I'm Douglas Brinkley, and I'm thrilled to be joined by David N. Rubenstein. We're going to talk about David's book, The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians. And the idea is a historian like myself gets to ask questions of our nation's premier interviewer of historians and history makers. Uh,
Well, thank
Glad
you
to
for
see
doing this. It's a bit of a role reversal,
it
but I
is.
appreciate your taking the time, and I want to thank everybody for getting up early on a Saturday to attend.
David, how did this all begin? The idea of a book like this, and you getting to talk to historians and other leaders and put a book together like this.
My thought was that it would be good if the members of Congress know even more about American history than they already know, since they're making the laws. And so I went to Jim Billington, who was then the Librarian of Congress, and said, "What about if we have a program where we bring the members of Congress together for an evening? We'll have a reception and a dinner, and I'll see if I can get a good historian. I'll interview them about their book on American history or whatever the subject might be." And he said, "Okay." We get about 250 to 300 people coming every time we do it. And members of Congress are kind of asked to sit with people from the opposite party and the opposite house because they don't usually get a chance to do so. There's no press there. And so they can feel free to kind of sit down and talk to somebody who's not really part of their party. It actually works out pretty well.
One of the chapters in the book is Chief Justice John Roberts. And what was it like interviewing him, and what did you learn from having that opportunity?
One of my side jobs, I'm chairman of the Smithsonian, and the way the Smithsonian is set up, there are 9 citizen regions and 6 congressional regions, but the chancellor overseeing all of us is the Chief Justice of the United States. So I spend a fair amount of time with him, and I asked him if I could interview him for this program. And when I began the interview, I said, "Did you always want to be, when you were growing up, Chief Justice of the United States?" He said, "Well, not really." "Did you want to be a justice of the United States Supreme Court?" "No." "Well, did you want to be a judge of any type?" "No." "Well, did you want to be a lawyer?" "No." "Well, what did you want to be?" "When I was growing up, I only wanted to be a historian. That's all I cared about." He said, "My love was American history." And my father said, "John, it's great to be a historian, but it's boring sitting time, all this time in the libraries, and you're writing books and maybe people won't read them and you won't make a lot of money and so forth." And John said, "I don't care. I only care about American history." So sure enough, he went off to Harvard. He majored in history. He was coming back from spring break one time, and he landed at the airport in Boston, Logan Airport, got off, got into a cab, and said to the cab driver, "Please take me to Cambridge." And the cab driver said, "Are you a student at Harvard?" "Yes, I am." "What are you majoring in?" "I'm majoring in history." Well, the cab driver said, "When I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also." So, so John thought that maybe he should go to law school as have a backup. So he did.
You strike me as somebody that it seems like you wanted to always be a historian, or is this a more recent bug? When you were growing up, did you read books about presidents and history makers?
Well, when I was in the 6th grade, my 6th grade teacher said, "Yesterday, John Kennedy was inaugurated. It was an incredible speech. It was poetry in prose form." And she took that speech, was only 14 minutes in length, and she went through it line by line, word for word. I didn't really realize everything about the speech and how wonderful it was, but in my mind, I just came up with the idea that I should learn how to be somebody who understood history better, and that I would like to go into government myself and serve my country as John Kennedy asked all of us to do. And so that maybe began my love of history. And then I did work on Capitol Hill, and I worked in the White House. And when you work in those places, which are making history all the time, you do get a sense of history. Also, I wasn't good at physics. I wasn't good at chemistry. I wasn't good at math. So this gave me something to be better at than the sciences.
One question about your collecting of documents of American history. How did that begin?
Like most things that are great in life, they happen by serendipity. So what happened was I was coming back from London. I saw that I was invited that night to go view the Magna Carta. I said, "Wait a second, how could somebody be inviting me to view the Magna Carta in New York? It should be in London." But so I was interested. I got there, and then all of a sudden I was told by the curator, it was at Sotheby's, that it was going to be auctioned off tomorrow, and that actually there are 17 extant copies of the Magna Carta, 15 in British institutions, 1 in the Australian Parliament, and 1 that Ross Perot had bought in the early 1980s from a family in England, had it in its possession for 500 years. They went land poor. They decided to sell it. He sent his lawyer over, Tom Luce, to buy it. The lawyer negotiated a price. He then rolled it up in a tube and then took it through British Customs. And they said, "What's in that tube?" He said, "Oh, the Magna Carta." They said, "Sure." So he took it through, and I don't think it had an export license, but and they put it on display in the archives, and then ultimately he decided to sell it. I decided to buy it because of the 17 copies, I thought one should stay in the United States. It was the inspiration for the Declaration of Independence and many of the things that happened in this country. And so while it wasn't an American document, it really inspired us in many ways. So I decided to buy it, and I did, and then I put it on our permanent loan at the National Archives. It'll be there forever. And so I got in the habit of buying other documents. So very often people call me and say, would you like to buy another Magna Carta? Because a lot of people have fake Magna Cartas. But so I said, no, I don't want to corner the market in Magna Carta. But I have bought rare copies of the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and I put them in places where people can see them. And the reason is this. Right now, we don't know much about history in this country. And as you know very well, as a great historian, we don't teach history as much as we used to. You can graduate from any college in the United States without having to take an American history course, and you can be a history major in 80% of the colleges in the United States without having to take an American history course as a history major. The results are 3/4 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 1/3 of Americans cannot name 1 branch of government. It seems as if 30% of Americans believe that George Washington crossed the Rhine River during the and 10% of college graduates, 10% of college graduates now believe that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court. Sadly. The most vivid thing that came about recently was the discovery of how lacking we are in our ability to pass a basic citizenship test. If you are a naturalized citizen candidate, you have to live in the United States for 5 years, and then you take a citizenship test, 100 questions, you have to pass 60. The people that take that test, presumably they've studied for it, 91% pass, 91%. The same test was given by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation recently to native-born citizens in all 50 states. And only one state, Vermont, could a majority of citizens pass that test. So it's a sad situation that we don't know much about civics and history. So in my, little way, I'm trying to, get people to learn a little bit more about it. And obviously I'm only one person, but I'm trying to do what I can. And obviously proselytizing about it is what I'm trying to do.
I want to switch over to The American Story. I just love the book, and there's so many personalities of our past in it. But I wanted to start with Martin Luther King Jr., your chapter on that. And you interviewed Taylor Branch, who wrote an extraordinary 3-volume history of Dr. King. What did you learn about Martin Luther King from your research and your time spent with Taylor Branch?
Taylor Branch, for those who don't know, he worked in the political campaigns. He's a historian. He wrote these 3 volumes, more than 2,000 pages on Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, not just about Martin Luther King, the first one of which won the Pulitzer Prize. Martin Luther King was assassinated at the age of 39. He won the Nobel Peace Prize at 35. We forget how young he was when he left us. One of the most recognizable things that he did was the great speech that he gave at the March on Washington in August of 1963. That was an event that President Kennedy didn't want to have. He thought it was going to lead to violence, so he tried to talk to civil rights leaders out of it. Martin Luther King was not the principal person who proposed it, but he was one of the 7 or 8 leading civil rights leaders. But the other civil rights leaders had some jealousy towards him because he was a better speaker than they were, and they were afraid he often captured the headlines when they were often doing the hard work, rightly or wrongly. So they decided when they had this that he had to speak, but they wanted him to speak last, one, because nobody really wanted to speak after him. Secondly, in those days, the news was all 15 minutes on the evening news at night. And they were afraid that after the event was held during the day, by the time the last speaker spoke, the evening news would already been, put together. So they wanted to speak earlier, get on the evening news. And so he agreed he would be the last speaker. And he wrote his speech the night before with a speechwriter. And the speechwriter worked on it until 3 or 4 in the morning. Martin Luther King came in, and then he gave the speech the next day, the last speech. And it's interesting about that speech. He gave the text as it was written, and then behind him is Mahalia Jackson. And she says, Martin, the dream. Tell him about the dream. And all of a sudden, he departs from the text, and he talks about I have a dream, which to whites in the audience and watching on television, it was a mesmerizing kind of thing. To the blacks who had heard this many, many times before, or had heard the way he talks in a certain cadence in black churches, it wasn't so unusual. But the whites were mesmerized by it. It obviously captured the day. And then later, when it was over, he was invited with the other civil rights leaders to go to the White House, and President Kennedy greets him and says, I have a dream. And he was in effect saying that was a great speech, and it was.
David, I once interviewed a man named George Raveling, who was a young African-American kid into sports, big, tall, and he was coming to the march, and he was crowding near the stage, and suddenly, because he had some girth to him, they said, can we borrow you to be like a bouncer to guard the stage? And so when Dr. King was there giving the speech. He was just a kid, kind of guard looking around. And suddenly King finished and walked away, and Raveling, young man, said, "Can I have that?" And he handed George Raveling his speech with all of his switches and
Wow.
notations. Raveling went on to be the head basketball coach for Iowa, and he has that "I Have a Dream" speech in a
Wow.
vault. That's his personal possession because he had the temerity to ask King for it, and King just said, "Here, kid, take it," you know.
Well, we forget that on the Great March in Washington, it had several 100,000 people. People were convinced that there would be the violence. Everything was closed that day in the federal government. Schools were closed and so forth. And the federal government was concerned that some of the speeches were so violent that they, in effect, controlled the mic system. And one of the people at the Justice Department had the ability to cut off the mic if the speech became too violent. Many of the civil rights leaders resented Martin Luther King because they thought he got more publicity. They were doing a lot of the hard work. They also thought his nonviolent approach was difficult to sell to their constituents, but it was something that he kept with. And Martin Luther King, in the end, is by far the most recognized civil rights leader. But those who lived through that period would say, well, there were many others who were very important as well.
I love the chapter on Ben Franklin that you have in the book. Walter
Right.
Isaacson wrote a great book on Franklin. What surprises you about Ben Franklin?
Ben Franklin is somebody that was an apprentice to his brother in Boston, not educated, goes to Philadelphia, builds a big business, makes a fair amount of money, and actually becomes the most famous person in the colonies. Far more famous than George Washington, who at the time before the Revolutionary War was not heard of. He was so well known that people in Europe regard him as by far the most prominent American. But he was a genius in many ways. He invented so many things. The bifocals he invented. He discovered more or less electricity in many different ways. He invented the furnace kind of system that people use, and the lightning rod he invented. And he was just such a well-respected figure. The only person who signed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Treaty of Paris ending the Revolutionary War.
You and I are friends, and if I had to guess, and I'm probably going to be wrong on this, I always think of you with George Washington. Part of it's because of your career in Washington, D.C. as a business person, philanthropist. Part of it is because you really have helped revitalize the Washington Monument as a philanthropist and made it into the great heirloom that it is, and your interest in Mount Vernon. Do you have a particular affinity to George Washington?
Well, when I was a young boy, my parents took me to Mount Vernon, and you get captured with the myth of George Washington and so forth, and the reality of George Washington. And so I did the same thing with my son when he was 8 years old. I took him to Mount Vernon, and walking around outside the back of the house, and there was like a little bit of a tree twig that had fallen on the ground, and my son said, "Dad, is that the cherry tree that George Washington cut?" And I said, "I cannot tell a lie." But Washington, think about this. He was the indispensable man, but he was indispensable for three reasons. One, he was the Revolutionary War general that helped us win the war. Second, he presided over the Constitutional Convention. Without his having presided, it probably wouldn't have had a constitution, and it certainly wouldn't have been ratified. And third, he became president, and he set the tone for what a president should be. And in all these cases, he didn't really want this power. And in fact, after the Revolutionary War, he gave up power and went back to Mount Vernon. And King George III said, if that's true, that he's giving up power, he's the greatest man in the world, because most men who win wars as generals stay on and preside. But he didn't really want to do that. And I'll just tell you an anecdote, though, about his death. So he goes back to Mount Vernon, and he's retired at the age of 64. He rides around on his plantation every day telling people what crops to plant and how to do things and so forth. And then one day he came back and from riding out, and he's dripping wet because it was snowing and sleeting. There are guests there, and he didn't want to be impolite, go upstairs and change. So he sat there pretty wet and had dinner. He got sick that night. The epiglottis in the back of his throat is swollen. They bring the doctors in, and they say there's no solution. A tracheotomy is not going to work. We have to cut the veins and let the bad spirits out. That doesn't work. So he died of shock. They open his will, and two things are in his will that are very interesting. Number one, he said he wanted to free his slaves as opposed to Martha's slaves. And he was the only founding father, the only one who agreed to free his slaves, but he did it upon the death of his wife. And secondly, he said, don't bury me for 2 days. Why would that be? Is that a religious custom? No, he was afraid of being buried alive. A lot of the doctors then were not so good. They thought somebody wasn't breathing so well. They put him in a coffin. So they put little bells in the coffin then, and you're supposed to ring it if you were still alive. And that's where the phrase dead ringer comes from.
Wow, that is great. And you mentioned Mount Vernon and you as a kind of a sacred spot. When you worked on The American Story, but in your life in general, are there some places in the United States you consider sacred ground, historic places that you just think,
Well, I think many people would say the most sacred ground, perhaps, in our country today is Arlington Cemetery. And when you go to Arlington Cemetery, where hundreds of thousands of Americans are buried, that was actually the house that was built in honor of George Washington by the Custis family, which was part of the Washington family. And then ultimately, Mrs. Custis married Robert E. Lee, became the Custis Lee Mansion. When the Civil War broke out, Robert E. Lee did not want to be the general of the Union. He turned that down. He became the general of the Virginia Army, later the Confederacy, but he had to vacate that house. It was too close to the Union. And so the Union ultimately took over that house and they used it. And then ultimately started burying soldiers there, knowing that Robert E. Lee, after the war, wouldn't want to come back and have a house overlooking Union soldiers' cemetery. That cemetery, though, is now our probably most sacred ground, at least in the Washington area. But another one historically is Gettysburg. Gettysburg is where we really built our first, in effect, professionally built cemetery for the Civil War soldiers. And I think that's obviously a very sacred ground, too. And then I wouldn't say it's sacred, but a very historic site that I encourage people to go to is Monticello. Thomas Jefferson's home at the top of a mountain. He designed it. It was a plantation and so forth. And when I got involved in helping to restore it, I said, I'll put up the money to restore it, provided you build out the slave quarters and make sure everybody knows that, in fact, Thomas Jefferson, for all of his intellect and great things that he did, he was a slave owner, and he had a relationship with Sally Hemings that is hard for people today to understand. If I could just explain that for a
yeah,
moment.
please.
Thomas Jefferson's wife died when Thomas Jefferson was 39. And he had at that time two daughters. He'd had four, two had died. There were two daughters left. On her deathbed, she said to Thomas Jefferson, do me a favor, never marry again, because I had a stepmother and I don't want our daughters to have a stepmother. My stepmother was terrible. I don't want our daughters to have a terrible stepmother. So what's he supposed to do? He says, okay, I won't marry again. And he actually never did. So he later becomes ambassador to France. As ambassador to France, he has one of his daughters with him. The younger one was too young to come over initially. Eventually, when she's about 9, they send her over. And they send her over with a caretaker named Sally Hemings. And so he meets Sally Hemings as she was then 16 years old. He sees her and he obviously falls in love with her. He has 6 children with her. Why did he fall in love with her? Well, many slave owners fell in love with or had affairs, whether you call it love or not, with their slaves, not uncommon then. But when he saw Sally Hemings, he saw his wife, and this is the reason. His wife was 39. He didn't know her when she was younger. But his wife's father was John Wayles, W-A-Y-L-E-S, a slave owner who had impregnated a slave. And one of the impregnated slaves' result was Sally Hemings. So John Wayles, the father-in-law of Thomas Jefferson, also was the father of Sally Hemings. So when he saw Sally Hemings, who was 3/4 white, he saw her, he saw, in effect, his wife as a 16-year-old. That doesn't justify what he may have done to her, but they had a relationship that went on for 30 years. And so she's living at Monticello for 30 years. Now, how did she have this affair with him for 30 years and people didn't know? Well, they did know. When he ran for president, it was reported that there was a picture of him as a rooster, and then they had a kind of a picture of a woman behind him who was dark skinned and called Dusky Sally. And so he never actually denied it. He never admitted it. But how did this happen? Well, if you go to Monticello, you'll see that there was a back door kind of staircase that you go into his bedroom. And the way his bedroom worked, he had it walled off from the rest of his house, and it was called the Sanctum Sanctorum. Nobody was allowed to go into his bedroom, his library, his study, and so there was this back door up staircase that obviously Sally Hemings came into, and they had 6 children together. And his deal with her was, if we have this relationship, any children that I have with you will be freed upon my death. And he did honor that, but he didn't free her. He didn't free her upon his death. And the reason was this: in Virginia, you had to go before the state legislature to get approval to let somebody be a freed slave living in the state, because they didn't want freed slaves wandering around free in Virginia. They wanted them to get out of the state if they're free. So Thomas Jefferson knew she wanted to stay in Virginia. And so if he had freed her upon his death, everybody would have had to approve it in the state legislature, and he didn't want more rumors to come about. Ultimately, his daughter did kind of free her, though.
Does the complexity of Thomas Jefferson and having to grapple with slavery, and it's really it's hurting Jefferson's image now
Yes.
in history, where John Adams got David McCullough to do a biography of him. You've interviewed David McCullough, and Adams doesn't have the burden of slavery. Is he more of a sustainable hero, John Adams, today because he doesn't have the yoke of slavery to grapple with?
You're correct. Thomas Jefferson and slavery, and it's now widely accepted by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which controls Monticello, that he did have this relationship. There are a few people who say that it's not true, but it's hard to refute the DNA evidence. John Adams, by contrast, was not a slave owner from Boston. He didn't own any slaves. He was not a well-liked person, though. He was very irascible. When the book was written by David McCullough, he kind of revived the image of John Adams. He had been forgotten. Remember, we have memorials to Jefferson in Washington. We have memorials to Washington in Washington. We have no memorial to John Adams. This book revived his image, and now it's in its 48th or 49th printing. And it won the Pulitzer Prize, as you know, but also it didn't quite get it over the hump, so there is still no memorial to John Adams in Washington, D.C. They've authorized one, but of course we have no appropriations for it, so there's no monument.
But I wanted to focus our remaining time on presidents in the 20th century. And one that I've loved the chapter in the book is with Robert Caro taking a look at LBJ and Lyndon Johnson. Tell me about work talking to Caro and what's your takeaway about LBJ?
Robert Caro spent 7 years of his life working over on a book called The Power Broker about Robert Moses, who was a prominent unelected official in New York. And this book comes out, becomes a great book, voted by Time magazine as one of the 100 best nonfiction books ever written. But he then decides, I want to write a book about a powerful person who's not powerful in a local area like New York, but powerful in the country. And his publisher says, his editor says, how about Lyndon Johnson? That was almost 45 years ago. He's now written 4 volumes of them, one of which has won the Pulitzer Prize. And he disappointed some of his fans because in between the 4th and the 5th volume, he came out with another book that's not related to Lyndon Johnson, just about how he does his writing. Lyndon Johnson was a person who had great insecurities about his intellectual achievements. He'd gone to a very small, not famous school. He gets elected to Congress, has a lot of power in Congress for a freshman and a young congressman because he had some deep-pocketed people giving him money that he could give to other members of Congress. But he gets to be a senator after he wins by 87 votes. He's called Landslide Lyndon. Robert Caro goes back and does the research and finds that in one of the precincts, there were 202 votes cast. 200 were cast for Lyndon Johnson alphabetically. In other words, 200 people voted alphabetically for Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
Obviously, the man he met who had these voting cards still with him, it was fraudulent. And so had Lyndon Johnson not gotten those 200 votes, he would not have been elected Senate. Maybe he wouldn't have become vice president or president, but he was. And 6 years after he became a senator, 6 years, he becomes majority leader. And then he thinks he's going to be president of the United States. He didn't take John Kennedy seriously. He called him, the boy, and so forth. And so when John Kennedy got the nomination in 1960, he asked Lyndon Johnson to be the vice president. Lyndon Johnson really didn't want it, but he accepted. And then ultimately, Robert Kennedy came several times to say, my brother really doesn't want you. Why don't you not take the nomination? But he does. And obviously, he later became president. A great president in some respects and domestically, great society. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 64, but Vietnam became his Achilles heel, obviously.
How does one take the time to understand who are transformational presidents, and was Johnson one of them?
Johnson was transformational in getting the Civil Rights Act through. And this was very interesting. He was from the South. Texas, sometimes they consider the South. You live in Texas. Sometimes they're Southerners. Sometimes they're Westerners. Yeah. But his best friends in the United States Senate were the leading segregationists. Richard Russell, James Eastland. These are the people who were completely against civil rights. Yet, as president, he basically pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 64, which today we take as a given, but it certainly wasn't at the time. He had this great legacy, and the reason he would say, according to Robert Caro, is he was asked, why were you doing this? And he'd say, well, if you have this power as president, what's the point of having it if you're not going to do something useful with it? On the other hand, in Vietnam, he couldn't extricate himself. He thought that the smart people were saying he should stay there, and he didn't want to be seen as the first president who lost the war. But the war went on for 8 or 9 years. And it's just amazing, the loss of life and how we tolerate it. Now, today, I doubt we would today with social media and people seeing things happening immediately. But in those days, you would hear about the news or see it a day or two later when the film was on CBS Evening News or NBC or ABC.
What should young people learn from history? How to use it to help them process our daily life?
There was a philosopher, Spanish-born philosopher taught at Harvard, George Santayana, and he famously said, others have said something similar, those who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. And the point of history is to figure out what mistakes were made in the past and try to not make them again, or what you learned from the past you did well that you might be able to do even better in the future. So the point of history is to learn what happened before and how we can live life better. What is life all about? Well, presumably, doing things better than our predecessors did in many different ways, and pursuing happiness in some respects without hurting other people. How do you do that and know what you should and shouldn't do if you don't know history? So I think people should learn history, and I'm saying that we should do more to educate people about history than we do today. That's the main message I want to convey to people. Learn more about history. You'll be a better citizen, and we'll have a better country if you do.
And I could think of no better book than The American Story for a young person to really start getting in. Thank you, David. Appreciate it.